having gone through the book, it recalled so many stories which I've heard from my childhood. My family had actually given me the advantage of everything that which is in reflections, except for the concluding part. I've had people in the banking sector who had closely watched how the banking sector has evolved, and therefore many of the anecdotes in this book are things which I've heard from my childhood and also heard of and about Sri Vaghul himself. So it is an occasion when I'm talking about an iconic figure who has been a big inspiration and a motivation for my family, but none of the organizers knew about it. So let me be open about it. None of them would have known about it. I've just said that to you all now. So there are just some aspects which occurred to me when I read the book. The first thing is, of course, there are two eyes which I want to highlight, which comes through when you read the book. Sri Vaghul is blessed with an integrity. He continues to uphold it. And as a result of which, his stature in the sector and also otherwise is very high. His integrity, the first eye. The second eye is the intuition that he seems to have had all through. Many of his intuitive decisions, which he confesses at some point, saying, I didn't want to tell the board that I was intuitively tuned to say, no, this proposal shall not be accepted, because his intuition was strong, but he had also checked up the fundamentals and the papers and everything to say that to himself that he was not wrong. So, at one instance, his judgment was respected, the board didn't go through with it. At another time, when uh, or when a different organization supported that particular proposal, they ended up in having a collapse, meaning the business shut. So it wasn't a worthy proposal to take up, and he intuitively knew it. His looking into the papers also reiterated his intuition. And that keeps coming every now and then in the book. So the two eyes that I'm highlighting about him, about his personality, are probably something which all of you will have experienced who have worked with him. So the integrity and the intuition in decision making. They are not frivolous intuition. It also comes with experience. It also comes with that rare clarity that you have in your mind. And therefore, your intuitions are not superstitious intuitions, they are informed intuitions. So the two eyes and the third eye, I would think, which I attribute, and of course all of you all will agree, you knew about it, and I'm not bringing in a new element, but it is an element which is very important in understanding Mr. Vaghul, and that is a selflessness in decision making, and as a result, a certain fearlessness which comes in for the consequence, one of which he had already mentioned here a few moments ago when he spoke. So the three eyes are the ones which dominate the personality of Mr. Vaghul, and that comes through in the book. But interesting for me are, and I'm glad to have read this book with that. It's not a very thick book, which you see, fairly slim but anecdotal, so it's easy flow to read. But for me, it gave me three things. One about the evolution of Department of Financial Services. Why did it come about? How did it come about? And what it became as it grew. Not much to the liking, but then, well, it served some purpose, so it was fine. So, but I could really see the transition of a department which at some point in time was not necessary, but later it became necessary. Later it became so upfront, driving the whole process of Indian banking system. The other is about the role the RBI governor, particularly that you recall of LK Jhaji, played in many of the decision making, many of the difficult times, and many of the knots which had been put into the system to unknot them, how and how frequently and the ways in which the governor, L.K. Jha, had helped in sorting the mess out comes through so beautifully. So the third one, of course, is about how the trade unions in the banking sector had worked through, had been very powerful, how negotiations happened, and how the help of Mr. Vaghul was sought to make sure that the negotiations would go on very tricky issue at that time. But anticlimax, sometime, how, in spite of a well structured way in which you want to take the negotiation, something else happens and politicians come into play. And as a result, you get a decision which is a bolt from the blue, uh, and how things flow. Just tell you how the process finally works or doesn't work. So this is a thin book, slim book, but it actually traces how the banking sector in India, since the first nationalization of SBI and post the nationalization in 70s by Srimati Indira Gandhi. So this flows through so beautifully. It's a fantastic historic piece. Of course, for each one, as Mr. Vaghul just said, no footnote, no references, no bibliography. But if you're serious in the business of understanding how Indian banking sector has worked through the socialist era, and I'm glad in a speech Mr. Vaghul spoke about the socialist era, how every government became pink and pinker and pink, short of turning red, the socialist energy was kept alive. And as a result, all these flow of events, if we are serious to understand the first, let's say, at least 40 years of India's banking, we need to go for each of these anecdotes back to the actual records to understand how it played out. Again, another name which in my family is said with a lot of respect is Talwar. The role that he played, the way in which he stood up to values. Nothing could make him shiver before authority because what he said was based on the rule and the law of the land. He didn't get scared about, being told, I'm sorry, then you may have to put your papers. Nothing worried him. And at that time, to have watched Mr. Talwar and later also to recount some more instances which were probably somewhat similar to Talwar's experience for Mr. Vaghul himself, also says how wielding of power, if not by the person who holds the power itself, the people around them, can make or break good professional careers. Sometimes it just falls flat, but some other times the power wielding gets its pound of flesh, if I may use that expression. All that is recaptured here. A thin book, but it recaptures all this. And the last thing, I did talk about the unions, I did talk about the Department of Financial Services, I did talk about how the RBI and the governor's role was at that time because of the sake of admiration or for gentlemen's sake or for the good world sake, the role of the RBI governor for things which should have otherwise been part of the process. I spoke about that. But the thing which was interesting for me, which was somewhat touched by Mr. Vaghul when he spoke, was the bankers and their interface with the political executive. I was very fascinated to read it. Again, something which I've heard from my childhood in my house. Mr. Vaghul narrated about how a minister had threatened him, saying, sorry, this is how it is. He has also recognized ministers who have agreed, political executives who have agreed the logic which he put forward, some case agreed and later made a U-turn, some others who have recognized and stayed away. But interestingly about And that, of course, when you read it, you will also get to reading it in detail, how a minister of state tries to prove his authority and closeness to the prime minister in the absence of the cabinet minister, and takes all the bank executives for appointment or to speak about grievances. And what a comedy of errors that event became are all captured here. It amazingly interesting, easy flow of writing. So it's good for you to read it without, I mean, it's not going to be overload. I wouldn't use the word racy, but somewhat it flows like that. So it's amazing. Probably this book, I would say, is sitting around for, let's say, 2 hours and listening to him orally, and that has been compiled into reflections. But if we were to sit with him, probably with some intermittent breaks, you can get at least 10 more books of this kind. That's the mind, and that's the versatility with which he's captured everything that has happened in those decades. Two things I want to add aside from the book. It was very interesting to hear Mr. Vaghul speak about Rajagopalachari, who used to talk to the communist in that kind of a direct way, Ramamurthy and others who were all stalwart communists. But a little anecdote which I've heard from my people, similar probably in such a similar occasion, is those days there was some kind of what can I say, some kind of a personal regard for one another. However bitter people spoke in the assemblies and parliaments, they had some kind of a care or concern for one another. One such instance which I've heard probably fits into that particular conversation which Rajagopalachari spoke in the assembly and said to the communists, "You are my first enemies." And for which, if I were to imagine in my mind picture, Ramamurthy would have gotten up and said, "Well, how dare you say this? And I know what you are all capitalists and everything else." And Ramamurthy would have been excited to give a reply, excited in the sense of with force of conviction. I've heard that Rajagopalachari used to have his coffee brought from home in a flask, and he would keep it there and drink it when he requires. So he once, in such an occasion, told Ramamurthy in Tamil, saying, "Ramamurthy, parvalla, or cup coffee kudi, inda eduthuko." Meaning, have a cup of coffee, it's all right, all that you're saying, but have the coffee and then continue speaking. So that is the kind of, amity people had among themselves. That's the kind of, cordiality with which people conducted the political affairs. I can't imagine giving a cup of coffee today to anybody saying, "It's all right, you're against me, you're speaking against me. Come, let's have a coffee." And then I can't imagine that. It can be grossly misunderstood. So that is one thing which I would take away from those days, fondly recollected. A pet peeve, if I'm permitted to say. The book also says, because of the race to prove that I'm a better socialist than somebody else, each one government went on bringing more and more business to the government, business which governments can't do. And therefore, the anxiety, the concern, and the hope that sometime people would come up with a meaningful getting government out of business comes through in one of the chapters, if I'm right, which was mentioned here also by Mr. Vaghul when he spoke. 2021 budget, thanks to Honorable Prime Minister, mentions for the first time in India's 1947 onwards history. It's an ancient civilization. I can't say India was born in 47. I can't say India became free. Several times India was subjugated. Several times it's become free. 1947 was from the imperial rulers. But since 47, in spite of all of us so desperately, many of us so desperately wanting India to have a government which will govern, facilitate, and help systems rather than run businesses. The first time the word privatization was used in the budget of 2021. And thanks to the Prime Minister Modi, who has that vision to say government should not be in business where it has no business. He said this publicly, this is not the first time, but actually to give it a frame, a structure, and the right language within a document of the government, which is the budget of the government. In 2021, in fact, many observers felt, what's happened? How did this come about? But that fond desire, if anything, that deep hope that sometime government of India would speak about it, was spoken about in February 21, sir. I would like to submit to your attention on that matter. So overall, it's a great book. It has no toxicity in it. In spite of all that exposure, in spite of all those threatening, calls, in spite of all those demands, in spite of all those political expectations and so on, it recounts everything in such a way that it just dispassionately puts it before us. See, this is how administration, political executive, banking, trade union, RBI, all of us functioned all together, and this is how far we've come. There's no bitterness, there's no holding somebody responsible for all the ills of the world through this little book. It's such a fantastic, dispassionate account. Other than the anecdotes themselves, it tells what maturity in an individual can show us. The maturity in Mr. Vaghul, the wisdom that he is so full of, tells you that you just observe the life, like Sanjaya observes the war in Kurukshetra and keeps feeding without his own commentary added to it. That's exactly what Mr. Vaghul has done here. And it's therefore a great book to read, great for all of us to have it here. And I'm really so humbled. A person about whom I've heard so much for his integrity, so much for his fearlessness, is today before me, and I'm honored to release his reflections. Thank you very much.